Hello and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place where we share creative and inspiring learning in our schools. Season 3, Episode 38. Hello and welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast with me, Mark Taylor. Today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Maelisa Hall, who's a clinical psychologist from the US. And I met Maelisa last week at Podcast Movement in California, and we were chatting about podcasts and the whole education system. And it turns out that Maelisa has the unique standpoint of being taught in school, but also having been homeschooled as well. So I thought it'd be really interesting from a teacher's point of view to actually hear some of those really insightful things that you can get from homeschooling, which maybe we can then bring back into the classroom. So hi, Maelisa, and thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great. Could you just take us through a little bit about what your schooling was like and how you started in school and at what sort of age and why homeschooling then became a really good option for you?
Sure. So I did start school in kindergarten, which in the US here is about age 5. And we typically have elementary school from kindergarten through grade 5 or 6. We don't have very standardized schooling here in the US, so the system actually does vary pretty greatly depending on what state or county or city you live in. But typically that would be elementary school, then middle or junior high school would be grade 6, 7, and 8, or sometimes just grade 7 and 8. And then high school would be grade 9 through 12, which is typically ages 14 through 18 for high school for us. And then we would go on to college. So I began homeschooling in 3rd grade when I was about 9 years old. And the reason we did that, my parents decided that I guess to go back a little bit further, my dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot. And that made it a little bit more difficult because there isn't a standardized set of lessons. So for example, in the US, one county might learn how to read in kindergarten and one county might learn how to read in 1st grade. So because there's that great variability, my parents actually put me in a private school so that they could at least then search out different private schools depending on where we moved, so I could stick with the same curriculum, which looking back is pretty smart, right?
Yeah.
So that did help because I did move to a couple of different schools. So even though I only went to school until 3rd grade, I was in 3 different schools throughout my schooling time and was able to stick with that same curriculum. And so if we moved in the middle of the year, for example, the classroom I went to was literally on the same lesson I had just left off. So I didn't have to worry about mixing anything up. But when we moved, our last move, my parents weren't very happy with the school. And because it was a private school, they're actually paying money for the private school. And it really wasn't working out. So my parents decided to take us out of school and try homeschooling just for the rest of the school year until they could figure out what to do, basically. Homeschooling wasn't really a great option for them. It was sort of well, this is our only option at this point until we can figure out what we want to do later, since we had just moved to the area and they weren't quite familiar with everything yet. So that's why we started homeschooling. And then it just so happened that was right, I think, the same month that we were taken out of school was when my dad was called up to Desert Storm. So he was deployed. And this would have been, when was that? I think it was like 1991 or something. And it worked out really well for our family because my dad was a pilot and he would actually come back to the States every 3 weeks or so. So even though he was deployed for, I think maybe 6 or 7 months, we were still able to see him in person every 3 weeks, but we had to drive up to New York State, and we lived in the Washington, D.C. area. So it was about I think like a 7-hour drive or something. So it was very doable, but would not have been doable if we had been in school, because then we would have been every 3 weeks. We could just drive up whenever we wanted. If it was a Wednesday, a Thursday in the middle of the day, it didn't matter. So the flexibility just worked so well for our family that my parents then, we just kept doing it and it kept working out. And so we actually were homeschooled all the way through high school until my brother and I both went to college.
That's amazing, and I think one of the biggest things there is the flexibility, and I've heard that before with people sort of from homeschooling points of view. It's just that, not having to be at the same place at the same time every day and every week, and that's a really, really big thing, which seems important, and especially in your scenario there, like you say, because it's incredibly important to be able to go in and and catch up with your family and everything. I mean, that's incredibly important. And so those early days when you first started being homeschooled, what was the thing that you found the biggest difference between the being in school and then actually just being at home all the time?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest difference for me was the flexibility. And I should mention, I actually loved school. I loved being in school. My mom said when I was like 3 years old, I was, as soon as I could talk or whatever, I was asking, when can I get on the school bus? And so I was never a kid who had a negative interaction at school. I mean, of course, I got in trouble and stuff sometimes, like normal kids do. But, I mean, all in all, I loved going to school. It was never a negative thing for me. But homeschooling gave us that flexibility. It was really nice to be able to wake up whenever we wanted to watch TV shows. As a kid, it was fun to just be able to like watch cartoons in the morning before we started schoolwork. And one of the biggest things, which I know that you and I had talked about, was that the time I actually spent doing homework and schoolwork reduced dramatically. And that's because my mom was able to tailor the lessons a lot more to me personally. So, for example, I remember this is a really significant memory for me. I was doing a math lesson and it was like 50 problems or something to do of like basic addition, subtraction, multiplication. And it's just, rote work doing it over and over again. And I asked my mom something about it, and she said, "Oh, well, you don't have to do all of those." And I was like, "What?" And she was like, "Yeah, you can just do every other one, or you can just do these first 10, something like that." And I was like, "Really? Why?" And, my little 9-year-old brain, I'm like, this doesn't make any sense, right? And then she would explain to me the concept of busy work, and she was saying, well, a lot of times the teacher has all these kids in the class and, the teacher needs time to work with different kids. She was like, but you already know it. I know that you know it. You're fine. You sitting there and doing it, 50 more times is not going to help you necessarily. So it was really cool that I was able to tailor a lot of that stuff myself. And then pretty early on, I would say probably from 5th or 6th grade or so, and I'm a person who has a lot of initiative just naturally, I started planning out my school years myself. So I would, at the beginning of the year, go through all the lessons and I would just count them up and say, okay, there's this many lessons of English, for example, in my book. And I would say, and then I would look at the calendar, okay, there's this many weeks. And I would say, okay, if I do 3 lessons, 3 days a week, then I'm kind of working ahead. And that gets me, this many weeks off in the middle of the year. And I would just talk to my friends and it would be like, okay, they're having winter break at this time. So I'm going to take my winter break then. They're having spring break. And so if I had 2 friends that had different spring breaks, I could have 2 weeks off for spring break. And it was pretty easy to plan ahead that way. So that was, I think, the biggest thing being a kid early on, that I noticed the level of flexibility, not just with time, but also with when I could do my work and how I could do my work. And I guess I was sort of creating like a batching or a block schedule for myself pretty early on.
And where did you do your work? Did you sort of always generally sit down in the same place and it's like now it's work time, or was it a bit more organic like that in terms of being able to be? Because one of the questions I've been asking people on this series is, how much time would you spend inside and outside and you're studying compared to exercise and all that sort of thing. So, I mean, it sounds like the time thing, like you say, you could wake up and watch cartoons and then study and that sort of thing. But when you actually then said, right, now I'm doing this piece of work, was that kind of then set in a particular place, or was that quite flexible too?
Yeah, that was really flexible. My mom really didn't care where we did our work as long as we were getting it done. So I usually did a lot of my work as kids do, like laying on the floor, have your book open, reading or writing something, or I would sit on the couch, or sometimes I would sit at the dining room table. So it really just depended on how I felt at the time, um, and what was most comfortable for me. I will say that's probably one of the things where even now it's difficult for me to sit at a desk for a really long period of time, because I really didn't have to do that for very much in my life. So transitioning to college wasn't as big a deal because college classes tend to be shorter, and you have a various schedule. You're not just sitting in one seat for 7 hours, for example. But like being at work, and when I've had desk jobs, that's been very, very difficult. So I've always um, sought out work in my adult life where I don't have to sit at a desk for a long period of time, because I've really just never gotten used to that. So, I mean, I think that's something that even, teachers in classrooms, I do think can apply in sort of creative ways, is, recognizing that I don't think it's really a natural thing for kids to sit for such a long time. And I think there can be a balance in having discipline and order in a classroom, which is really necessary, but then also, giving children flexibility to be able to get up and move around and physically change location. Even doing that can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really struck me then, which I think is really interesting, is that what often happens in school is the fact that students that need specific help, and it needs to become personalised learning, get the help they need if the school deems them to be struggling, and whether that's just because they feel they need more help, or whether it's because the tests are really important and they need to make sure the grades are high enough. I mean, it depends which side of the fence you want to look at that sort of thing. But that being said, that what you just said then about being able to move around the room actually is a way of really helping at that sort of personalised learning, even if you can't have completely individual strands of learning going through because there are too many people in the class. Being able to just maybe have more control as a pupil of where you're doing your work, and as long as you then make sure that you do that with a bit of discipline and a bit of understanding as well, hopefully you get a bit of a two-way street. Then I think then you can have a little bit of personalised learning, which you can actually have within a whole classroom, as long as you're not being disruptive, and you take that as a really positive thing. I think that would probably be a really good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can even say, related to this but unrelated to homeschooling, um, being a psychologist and testing people, one of the things I do is ADHD evaluations for adults. So people who have not had a diagnosis yet but feel that they've had it. And almost every single one of the adults that I have assessed has told me of struggles they had in school, and they had a turning point in usually in elementary school, where they were then able to be successful because a teacher, and they'll almost every single time, they'll remember that teacher's name, and they'll say, because this one teacher saw this potential in me and gave me that flexibility and helped me out. And they will talk about how that one teacher, either gave them extra things to do, or let them get up, or let them stand up while they did some of their work, or let them get up and move around. Whatever those kind of minor things are, that teacher made a really dramatic difference in this kid's life and really shifted things so that they were still able to be successful.
And that's really, and I think we've all got one of those people, haven't we? And as you say, it's that personalised connection, isn't it? Because they see you as a human being, not just one of a member of the class, and so therefore that story, that backstory of who you are, and then them understanding who you are and what works for you, and then you've got a real kind of team building going on between the student and the teacher. And I think from there on, anything is then possible. It's not just about learning; it's actually about growing, and I think that's probably a really important part of everyone's sort of school days.
Absolutely.
And what the thing I just thought of there when you were talking about sort of teachers and how they do that, how does I mean, a teacher is obviously a sort of a kind of a mentor and that kind of thing. When you're being homeschooled, you said that your mum was sort of doing all of those things. How do you feel that sort of mentoring idea, or connecting with other people, which obviously you don't have on a daily basis with other teachers and more people within the school grounds? Do you sort of meet up with other people, and do you have sort of a mentor or other people that you can spark ideas of or support you when you were being homeschooled?
Yeah, and definitely people do this differently. There are a lot of homeschool organizations and homeschool communities, and they have various levels of involvement. So a lot of people will join one of those to do sports and even to share classroom responsibilities. So for certain subjects, everyone might go to, so and so's house and learn science, for example, from this one mom, which is usually the case because a lot of people who homeschool are actually former teachers too. So that's a common thing. For us, we tried that. We didn't really connect with a couple of the homeschool groups that were in our area. So my brother and I kind of told my mom, like, yeah, we're not really into it. Even though I am, as I think you've discovered, pretty extroverted and from our time at Podcast Movement, which is a lot of fun. So I love to be around people, which is a big reason that I loved school. And so that part, I will say I didn't necessarily miss the schooling part of, being with other people because you are supposed to sort of sit quietly and do your own work and everything. Um, but I always made time to, hang out with friends in my neighborhood. And thankfully I was able to get that social aspect in my neighborhood or through our church. And as far as mentors go, that is where I would say more in high school, we had a specific like group that we would be in. Our youth group had small groups. I forget exactly what we called them. We called them something different, but they're, groups of maybe like 5 to 6 teen girls, and we had one mentor and we would go through different things. So it was a really nice setting to get mentorship, not necessarily from education, although she did also happen to homeschool her children, which was rare in our church and in our neighborhood actually. But she ended up being very much a mentor to me throughout my high school years. So I did have someone like that where there was a different adult I felt I could go to for help or for support or even just for fun. Um, and I think when I was younger, I probably didn't have that quite as much.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense, and I think what I'm beginning to understand is that there's a much more of a blurred line between I'm now learning officially because I'm in school, and I'm being part of the wider community, because the two are slightly the same thing, I guess. Because if you're able to be learning in someone else's house, like you said, because you're having sort of a group session, and I guess with sports and those kind of things, that's going to be the case. And if you're in church and you've got an organisation outside of school, then it's much more natural, and I've found, having spoken to some other people during the season, that actually the parents' role and actually the support and the community around it is really important. And actually, there's a bit of a blurred line there too. And
Yeah.
the really important thing is that whatever you sort of take from school, because everybody's school is different, the onus it does sort of boil down to the parents and also the people around it. And there's no right or wrong, but there is a kind of what do you need now. So if you're very academically based learning in school, the things like, when we've talked before about, the exercise and maybe mindfulness or volunteering or being part of a sort of a wider community, that sort of comes out of school because that's the particular opportunity. Yet in the Overstone Primary School, who I talked to at the beginning of this season, they talk very much about the fact that they actually have people that get elected onto their sort of student body, and they're able to organise things. They go out to the community and organise events so that they get to interact with different aged people. They really like their sort of school choir and all those things. So that all of that's really interactive. So therefore, it does depend on your scenario, doesn't it? And I think actually, certainly from my point of view, I'm sort of often quite black and white about, I think everything should happen in school, and everything that you need to learn should be from that particular standpoint, and we try and give the kids the best they can. But actually maybe just sort of slightly allowing it to seep through to kind of a little bit, like I said before, about the story, really. If you understand what a child does outside of school, whether it's a club, whether it's an organisation or a church or something that they're actually doing, being able to bring that into school, even if it's only in terms of a conversation, it then starts to join it all up, rather than just kind of, now we're studying and now you're going home. And I guess that's probably a really important thing from a student point of view as well. And I guess, as you said, being homeschooled, those things really just happen automatically as part of the same package, really.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it is. I mean, I think about being at church and also Another really influential thing from middle school through most of high school was I took art lessons. And I will say, my parents were always very good about wanting us to be involved in some type of sport or hobby or something like that. So we always took swimming lessons, and I did a lot of swimming, and my thing was art. So I would take art lessons. And my art teacher was definitely a big mentor for me. And there were some difficult things our family went through during sort of my junior high, early high school years. And having that art teacher, Mr. Dufour, he was, a really great mentor to me during that time as well. So I think it was really nice. And my mom even sort of reflected on that later, like, yeah, he was almost like your counselor, um, because it was nice to have those outside resources and outside influences. Um, Even though my family was always, really supportive, it was nice that they made sure I had other people that I could reach out to and that I was involved with. And I think, like you said, it really does come down to the parents' involvement. I mean, I think so many times people will want to, like, in homeschooling communities, they'll want to tout off all of the great benefits of homeschooling and all of these statistics and how, homeschoolers win the spelling bee and all the awesome things homeschoolers do, right? But I think the reason that homeschoolers do tend to do well academically really lies with the fact that their parents, inherently in the fact that they're homeschooled, are really involved in their education and are typically very invested in making sure that they are doing well. They're invested in checking up on things. They're not simply, sending a kid off and expecting somebody else to do everything for them. So I think that's a really, really important part of any kid's life. And obviously not all kids have that. And I think when teachers can provide that, when they notice that parents aren't, I've seen that be really, really beneficial for people.
Yeah, I mean, as a parent myself, that's definitely true because in that particular scenario, I was just thinking that we're incredibly hands-on and we're incredibly supportive, but only to a point. In as much as if there's something going on or a particular thing that we don't agree with, we sort of have a little bit of a line that we have to sort of, I guess, straddle in some ways, because one, we want to make our kids independent and actually think for themselves, and one of our big no-nos is homework during holidays. I believe that it's really important that you have downtime and a chance to reflect and a chance to sort of get your energy back and then sort of start again. And so that always feels a little bit funny because that's almost going against the school, because the school will still set homework. But at the same time, it's that kind of, sometimes you want to support a piece of work, but actually, as a parent, I don't actually understand what it is that they're trying to do, or if it's maths, for example, the particular route that they're taking to be able to get the answer. It seems to be different than when I was at school, and it seems to be different from when our older kids were in school as well. And so therefore, it's quite hard to be so sort of on top of it all, because we don't actually know what we're doing. We can support them to do their work, but we're not necessarily as au fait with how you go about it, if that kind of makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I hear so many people talk about that here. They're doing what's called Common Core math, and it's a completely different way of, I guess, doing basic arithmetic. And so many parents feel really left out of the whole process because they feel like they can't even do their third graders' homework.
Absolutely. So then you sort of end up you have to take a step back a little bit, and you then have to say, well, we have to therefore allow the school to do what they're doing. That's what they're there to do, and that the teachers are highly qualified and able to do that. And I just wonder whether there's a real sort of nugget of something for teachers and for us all to take away. It's just maybe that dialogue between the school and the parents, in terms of, they often do sort of evenings of, this is what we're doing and why we're doing it, and how we're teaching your children. But maybe there just needs to be a little bit more of understanding there, in terms of how we can support those both on an emotional level, so that actually we can support them to do the work they're doing, but also understand it a little bit more, because then when they get frustrated, we can just give them that extra little bit of help and a little bit of support that maybe we can't do if we just turn around and say, well, I don't know how to do it, you'll have to just ask your teacher, because then you sort of get a little bit of a stonewall scenario, and that's never really been very successful from our point of view as a parent, especially if it's been homework related, because the whole thing just comes to a grinding halt, and so, yeah, I just wonder there, as teachers, whether just, I don't quite know how you do that, but just having that slightly more of a transition between the parents understanding exactly what it is that the children need to do, and maybe more of that. And I've thought this before sometimes, is that if the homework and stuff they do at home is much more directly linked to what they've been doing in school, the children are then often actually able to show the parents what it is that they've been doing, and then they're just practicing, or they're just enhancing a little bit of what they've done already, rather than sometimes, in my experience anyway, the homework's come down and it's the start of a new topic, and so they've sort of used it to kind of get the idea of this is what you're going to be doing. But that's quite difficult then, because then the onus is on the parent almost to start teaching it from the very beginning, and then I think you're on a little bit of a hiding to nothing, because if you're not able to understand it or set it off, then the child is already on a little bit of a back foot and not sort of a little bit unsure about what it is that they're going to try and progress through.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. And I think even involving parents as much as you can. I know not, a lot of parents are working, and so it's not like you can be at your child's school all of the time. But I do know that even when I was in school, my mom knew our teachers really well. And when my dad had kind of an off schedule later on, near the end when I was still in school. And so my parents, for example, would like come in and take me out for lunch. And we would go out and have lunch in the middle of the day and then come back. And I remember the teacher at that school, and of course this is one of the reasons we left, but the teacher at that school thought that was a horrible idea for my parents to come in and take me out to lunch in the middle of the day. And at previous schools, that was always seen as a good thing, because teachers are just noticing that, hey, my parents are involved, and it also made my parents interact with my teachers more often because they were talking with them. And I did notice that was a huge shift when I was at that last school, and it felt more adversarial, like the teacher against the parents, versus in previous schools where whenever my parents came in, whether it was helping out with things, whether it was talking to my teacher, whether it was wanting to just sit down and have lunch with me at the school cafeteria, it was always welcome. And it was very much seen as, we're in this together, we're working together. And I will say those teachers really seemed to enjoy what they were doing and seemed to want to do whatever was best for the kids in the school, and not necessarily look at, this is how we're supposed to do things, or you're, invading my territory.
Yeah, I guess that's it, because it's really about familiarity, isn't it? Because if you're going into a school regularly to either do the pickup or to, like say, to take them out to lunch or anything like that, then you have a much more general conversation happening all the time, and the relationship's much easier. When the only time you're going into school is because it's parents' evening, or they're telling you how well your child is doing as part of their progress, then it becomes very much, well, you tell me this and I'll tell you that. And the relationship then is very different between the parents and the teachers. And actually, I think that much more organic, more regular thing, especially as the child starts to grow up, because obviously when they're tiny, you're there much more in the playground, dropping off and picking up. But as they start to get older, towards the end of primary school here, sort of age 9, 10, 11, that might be slightly different. And especially, I guess, if you work and your child goes home with an after school club or a babysitter or something like that, then you have even less direct access, and I guess that probably makes quite an important difference, really.
Yeah, and hopefully technology, obviously this wasn't happening 20 years ago when I was in school, but I've heard of being able to email teachers, and teachers having different things online where parents can then communicate, and hopefully that can help with everyone's demands on time and maybe not being able to be available, but still increasing communication.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's the Class Dojo and those sorts of things over here in the UK, which have really helped that kind of thing and that sort of ongoing scenario. Certainly in Tommy, our our son's school, everything is online. We know what he's had for lunch, which classes he's been to, how well he's done in his tests often before he even knows. So it's actually quite, certainly all those things are available now. And like I say, the ability to email teachers directly as well, which is probably good or bad depending on how much time and how many people are getting in contact. But
Yeah, yeah.
and we had an interesting conversation last night, actually. We were just staying, while I was doing my show this week, was chatting to my sister-in-law and my brother-in-law, and we were talking about the sort of the more practical skills, which I would quite like to have learned in school. One of the things, I might be able to do algebra, but one of the things I found hard to do, having not had much opportunity, was to how to put a shelf up straight, what kind of drill to use and that sort of thing. So I'm just interested, as a homeschool person, things... Did you sort of have specific lessons because you had the option to do things completely yourself? Once you got out of the academic arena, did you have more practical things that you did which was technically part of your homeschooling, or was that just more family life? And I guess that might even go into sort of financial related things. One of the questions I was asking on this season was talking about money and budgets and savings and financial planning and that sort of thing, which often doesn't happen in schools unless they're doing a project of some description. But did you sort of have that part of your sort of homeschool curriculum, or was that just, again, that sort of blurred line between your general home life and actually your education?
Yeah, I think it was more of a blurred line, stuff that probably would have happened regardless. I think the biggest difference was we did do a lot of trips. So since my dad had kind of an off schedule, um, pretty much through most of my life while we were homeschooled. And since we were homeschooled, that gave us flexibility to plan longer trips in the middle of the year. And so my family did travel a lot. So I'd say that was probably the biggest difference because we were able to go to Colonial Williamsburg. We were able to do a trip cross country and see all of these different things. And so we did get to experience a lot that we probably wouldn't have if we had had to stick with a regular school schedule. But as far as other things, like, for example, when I started working when I was 16 and had to do taxes, I mean, I think, I would have been asking my parents for help with that regardless, whether or not I was in school. So I can't think of other things that would really fit that mold, except for the travel.
Yeah, and I guess it's the freedom, isn't it? And that's the difference, because you have, when it's just like, say, yourself and your brother and your family going on a trip, then you could just decide to do it and you've got no ties. If you've got a class of 30 and then you've got all the expenses and the logistics of that, it's obviously much different. But I think it is true, certainly, that school trips are incredibly important, and I think that getting out of the classroom in whatever you can, and I think to make the sort of the correlation between the two types of learning, it's just being able to bring those things together. Any trips you can do really does help. Any personalised learning that you can do really does help, and anything you can just do to really bring that into the classroom to make the story of the child, and also I think the idea of their progression and what it is that you're trying to do and how you can help them get to where they want to go or whatever they're trying to achieve, is key. And I think that's probably where the similarities and the ideas of where the two types of education come together. And I think that's a really important thing, and it's really tricky as a teacher to do that when you've got a whole class. But I think part of it's just being mindful that maybe that's what we're aiming for, that's what we can achieve. And so when you're having that decision of, should we go on that trip or not, actually let's try and make it happen. And can I just let this child have a bit more freedom and maybe stand up for a few minutes while he's doing his work, or maybe go and sit on the carpet and do an extra bit of work? Actually, just at least give it a go and see if it works for them, because if it works for them, it's probably going to work for you, because it'll free up some of your time and your energy for the other people in your class as well. And maybe that's the thing, just to explore.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I would say, to think outside the box as much as you can and talk with other people. I can even think of one friend I know who was a teacher in a Montessori school, and he would talk about, this one kid I have, he's really, really smart, and he's always finishing his work early. So my friend was going to the library and picking up books about topics he knew the kid was interested in, so that he could then give the kid something to do and continue learning. But it was, based on this child's interests. And so I think when you see things like that, there's always something you can do to try and personalize things a little bit for those kids that need it.
Yeah, I think that's a really a good place for us to kind of bring it all through to a close and to sort of tie those things up. It's fantastic. And if there's one piece of information or advice you'd like to give our teachers listening in terms of what you've learned from having the experience of being homeschooled and being in school, is there anything that you'd like to impart for us?
I think, I mean, I don't know why, but I think the thing that comes to mind first is that kids can tell when you enjoy being there and when they don't, and when you don't. Because those are the memories I have, because I had fewer teachers to remember,
Yeah.
right? And I loved the teachers that loved being there and that wanted to teach me and wanted to help. And I noticed the teachers who I was typically a good kid, quote unquote. And I noticed the teachers who maybe liked me but treated other kids differently.
Yeah.
And, so I took note of that and could tell when teachers didn't like certain kids or didn't want to be at work that day. And that made a big impact, I think, on all of us in the classroom.
Yeah, and that, I guess, that really brings the whole idea of well-being and actually being your best person that you then bring to your class. And so it's one of the things that you often find teachers, they struggle with time, we struggle with energy, we struggle with long terms and all of those things, and lots of things to do. And actually looking after yourself and putting yourself first so that you do get as much rest as you possibly can, that you sort of feel like you're on your best day every day to the best of your ability, despite all the things that we have to do. That means that you can be your more authentic self, and what that brings is much more than anything you can ever really write down or analyse. And as you say, because children do know and they can pick all those things up, and that's something I'd like to explore certainly in the future, just to really sort of support you as teachers to be able to sort of be your best self all the way through the year, not just as the new term starts, but also when we get to the end of term and everyone's starting to get exhausted. How do you do that? How do you say no if you really can't do any more stuff? How do you make sure that you've got as much energy as you can? And we'll talk more about that in the coming season. So that's brilliant. Thank you so much for being on, Maelisa. I really appreciate your time, and it's really interesting both hearing sort of the idea of what it's like between the homeschool and school, but also the American viewpoint as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Education on Fire podcast. For more information of each episode and to get in touch, go to educationonfire.com. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.